As Barron Trump spoke quietly at his table in a small-town diner, a waitress passing by overheard his words. What she did next stunned everyone in the room, creating a moment no one would forget. It was a cozy little diner, the kind of place where the smell of pancakes and freshly brewed coffee hung in the air, mingling with the faint sizzle of bacon on the grill. The walls were lined with old photos, a mix of faded landscapes and black and white snapshots of the diner's early days. The hum of quiet conversations and the clatter of dishes created a soothing rhythm, while the jukebox in the corner played a soft, familiar tune. The tables were filled with people easing into their meals, some alone, others in groups. A man in a worn flannel jacket sat at the counter, reading a newspaper, while a young couple near the window laughed quietly over a shared plate of fries. The waitress moved between the tables with practiced ease, her notepad tucked into her apron pocket. Her name tag read Maggie, and though her smile was warm, her tired eyes hinted at the long shift she was powering through. At a corner booth, Barron Trump sat alone, blending in despite the quiet elegance he carried. He was dressed casually in a plain hoodie, his tall frame slightly hunched over as he stirred his coffee absently. He seemed deep in thought, his gaze occasionally drifting to the window, where the glow of the evening lights reflected off the glass. Maggie noticed him as she refilled a customer's coffee cup, her brow furrowing slightly. He wasn't someone who frequented the diner, but there was a calmness about him that caught her attention. Still, she didn't linger. There were tables to clean and orders to take. The air in the diner was relaxed, almost unremarkable. But as Maggie passed Barron's table, a snippet of his conversation caught her ear. It wasn't loud, just a quiet remark made into his phone, but something about it made her pause. For a split second, her steps faltered, and her gaze flicked toward him. She continued walking, but her mind lingered on the words she'd just overheard. The diner carried on as it always did, but for Maggie something had shifted. Whatever she'd heard, it stuck with her, pulling at her heart in a way she couldn't ignore. And though the night seemed ordinary, it wouldn't stay that way for long. Maggie returned to the counter, her hands moving almost on autopilot as she refilled the sugar canister. Her mind, however, was far from her work. She kept glancing toward the corner booth, where Barron Trump sat quietly, his phone now resting on the table beside his coffee cup. The words she'd overheard echoed in her mind. I just wish I could do more for them. She wasn't sure who he was talking about or what the situation was, but the tone in his voice, calm yet full of concern, stirred something in her. Maggie had worked in this diner for over a decade, and she'd heard all kinds of conversations in passing. Most were mundane complaints about work, plans for the weekend, or debates about who'd pay the check. But this felt different. There was a weight to it, a sincerity that tugged at her curiosity. Her shift continued, and she tried to push the thought aside, focusing instead on taking orders and clearing plates. But every time she passed Barron's booth, she found herself stealing quick glances. He wasn't on his phone anymore. Instead, he seemed lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from his coffee. As the dinner rush slowed, Maggie took a moment to lean against the counter, rubbing her temples. Another hour until her shift ended, and then she'd be home, where a stack of bills and an empty fridge awaited her. It had been a hard month, harder than most. Tips were sparse, and her youngest needed new shoes for school. The weight of it all pressed down on her like it always did, a constant reminder of how tight things were. She sighed and turned back to work, but as she did, her gaze fell once more on Barron. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the storm of worries in her own mind. And yet, there was something about him that seemed familiar. Not his face, necessarily, but the quiet way he carried himself. It reminded her of someone she used to know, a regular customer who always made sure to leave a generous tip, even when he didn't have much to spare. Maggie's thoughts were interrupted when the man at the counter called her over for a coffee refill. She quickly obliged, offering a polite smile, but as she turned to head back, she noticed Barron standing up. He reached into his pocket, pulled out some cash, and placed it neatly under his coffee cup. Then, with a small nod to himself, he headed toward the door. Curiosity gnawed at Maggie. As soon as he left, she walked over to the booth and picked up the bill. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw what he'd left, far more than enough to cover the cost of his coffee. It wasn't just a tip, it was a gesture. A small act of kindness that didn't seem random. Her chest tightened. She looked around the diner, wondering what had prompted it. Then her eyes landed on the older man sitting 2 tables away, quietly sipping a cup of plain black coffee. His clothes were worn, his boots scuffed, and his shoulders hunched like the weight of the world rested on them. Maggie had seen him in here before, always ordering the cheapest item on the menu and nursing it for as long as possible. Suddenly, it all clicked. Barron must have noticed the man just as she had. And whatever conversation she'd overheard earlier, it had to be about helping people like him. Maggie felt a pang of guilt for not noticing sooner, for being too wrapped up in her own struggles to see the kindness unfolding right in front of her. She stood there for a moment, holding the bill in her hand, the weight of Barron's quiet generosity settling over her. But instead of just pocketing the tip and moving on, Maggie felt something stir deep inside her, a feeling she hadn't felt in a long time. The urge to do something, to make a difference. What Barron had started wasn't finished yet, and Maggie realized she had a choice. She could let it end here, or she could find a way to carry it forward. Maggie stood by the booth, holding the bill with Barron's generous tip, her mind racing. She looked over at the older man a couple of tables away. He sat quietly, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup like it was a source of warmth he desperately needed. She could see the weariness in his posture, the kind of exhaustion that didn't just come from a long day, but from a hard life. She felt a tug in her chest. Barron had done something kind, but it felt incomplete. The man hadn't even realized someone had noticed him, let alone that a gesture had been made in his honor. Maggie's fingers tightened around the bill. She couldn't let the moment pass without doing something. Taking a deep breath, she walked over to the man's table. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice hesitant but kind. The man looked up, startled. His eyes were tired but gentle, and he managed a small smile. "Yeah," he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Maggie hesitated for a second before holding up the bill. "There was a customer here earlier," she began. "He left this." "For you," the man's brows furrowed in confusion. "For me," he said, his tone skeptical. "Why would anyone do that? I think he saw you sitting here," Maggie explained. "Maybe he wanted to help." He didn't say much, just left this and walked out. The man's gaze dropped to the bill, and his expression softened. "I don't understand," he muttered, almost to himself. "People don't just do things like that." Maggie pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, surprising even herself. "Sometimes they do," she said gently. "But I think he wanted it to mean more than just covering a coffee. Maybe it's a reminder that people care." The man's hand trembled slightly as he took the bill from her. He stared at it for a moment, his jaw tightening. "I've been coming here for weeks," he said quietly, "trying to make this little bit of change stretch as far as it'll go." "I didn't think anyone noticed." "Well, someone did," Maggie replied, her voice firm but kind. "And maybe it's not just about the money. Maybe it's about letting you know you're not invisible." The man's eyes glistened as he looked up at her. "That means more than you know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Maggie sat back, feeling a strange mix of emotions: pride, sadness, and something else she couldn't quite name. But the moment wasn't over yet. She glanced around the diner, her gaze landing on a couple at a nearby table who had been quietly watching the interaction. They exchanged glances and whispered to each other before the woman waved Maggie over. "Is everything okay?" the woman asked softly, nodding toward the older man. Maggie hesitated, unsure how much to share. But something about the woman's kind expression made her decide to be honest. "There was a customer earlier," she explained. "He left a generous tip, but I think it was meant for that man over there. He's been struggling." The woman's eyes softened, and she glanced at her partner. "Can we help too?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe pay for his next few meals." Maggie's heart swelled. "That would be amazing," she said, her smile breaking through. "I think it would mean a lot to him." The couple nodded, and the man pulled out his wallet, handing Maggie enough cash to cover several meals. "Tell him it's from someone who's been there," he said quietly. "We all need a little help sometimes." As Maggie returned to the counter, she noticed more customers watching the scene unfold. A young man at the far end of the diner called her over next. "I heard what's going on," he said, his tone hesitant but sincere. "I don't have much, but I'd like to chip in too." One by one, the diner's patrons began to contribute, some leaving cash, others simply offering words of encouragement. Maggie felt overwhelmed, not just by their generosity but by the way Barron's simple act of kindness had sparked something much bigger. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about people coming together, recognizing a shared humanity, and choosing to care. By the time the rush died down, Maggie had enough to not only cover the older man's meals for weeks, but also to give him a little extra to take home. She approached his table again, her arms full of contributions. "You've got a lot of people rooting for you tonight," she said, her voice warm. The man looked up at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I don't know what to say," he murmured. This doesn't happen to me." Maggie smiled, feeling tears prick at her own eyes. "It does tonight," she said simply. And as the man sat there, surrounded by the quiet kindness of strangers, the weight on his shoulders seemed to lift, if only a little. The ripple of generosity that Barron had started was still spreading, touching everyone in its path. And for Maggie, It was a moment she knew she'd never forget. As Maggie prepared to close the diner for the night, the older man approached the counter, holding the envelope she had handed him earlier. It was filled with the contributions from the other diners, but he hadn't touched a single bill. His hands trembled slightly as he set it down in front of her. "I can't take this," he said, his voice low but firm. "It's too much. I don't even know how to say thank you." Maggie looked at him, her own eyes reflecting the mix of emotions swirling in the room. "It's not just for me," she said gently. "Everyone in here wanted to help, and it's not about what you take. It's about knowing you don't have to carry everything alone." The man stared at the envelope, his jaw tightening as he fought back tears. "I haven't felt this since my marriage ended," he admitted, his voice cracking. "It's been so hard, losing my wife, trying to get by on my own. I didn't think anyone noticed I was still here." Maggie felt her chest tighten. "We noticed," she said simply. "And you matter." Just then the diner's door jingled as it opened, and to everyone's surprise, Barron Trump stepped back inside. He looked around the room, his expression calm but purposeful, and walked straight to the counter. Maggie froze, unsure what to say, but Barron spoke first. "I realized I left something behind," he said softly, nodding toward the older man. "Not my wallet or anything like that, just unfinished business." The older man blinked in confusion as Barron approached. "You're the one who started this, aren't you?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying a mix of awe and gratitude. Barron nodded, his face humble. "I just saw someone who needed a little help," he said simply. "But it looks like everyone else did too." The older man shook his head, his emotions spilling over. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling. "This isn't just help. This is hope. I've given up on people noticing me, on anyone caring, and tonight you all proved me wrong." Barron placed a hand on the man's shoulder, his expression steady but kind. "Sometimes, all it takes is one person to remind us we're not invisible," he said. "And it doesn't stop here. You can take this moment and pass it on." The older man nodded slowly, his tears flowing freely now. "I will," he said softly. "I promise I will." Maggie watched the scene unfold, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. The room was silent, the weight of the moment settling over everyone. Even those who had been quietly sipping their coffee or scrolling through their phones stopped to take it in. Then Barron turned to Maggie. "Thank you," he said simply, his tone filled with sincerity. "You carried this further than I ever could have." Maggie shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. "It wasn't just me," she said. "You gave us all a reason to care." Barron offered a small smile before glancing back at the older man. "Take care of yourself," he said softly. "And don't forget, you're not alone." With that, Barron turned and walked back out the door, leaving behind a diner full of people who had been changed in ways they hadn't expected. The older man sat back down, the envelope still clutched in his hands, and Maggie returned to the counter, feeling the weight of the moment settle into her chest. It wasn't just about a meal or an envelope of cash. It was about the connection, the reminder that even in the hardest times, people could come together and make a difference. And as the night carried on, the impact of that simple act continued to ripple outward, touching everyone who had been a part of it. The diner settled into a quiet hum after Barron left, but the energy in the room was anything but ordinary. The older man remained seated at his table, the envelope of cash still in his hands. His fingers traced the edges, as if trying to make sense of what had just happened. For a long moment, he simply stared at it, his expression a mix of disbelief and gratitude. Across the room, a young couple whispered to each other, their eyes soft with admiration. The woman finally leaned over and said, "You know, seeing something like this makes me want to do more. It's easy to forget how much small acts can mean." The man nodded, his voice thoughtful. "Yeah. It's like one person steps up and suddenly everyone realizes they can too." The waitress, Maggie, stood behind the counter, watching the older man with a lump in her throat. She didn't need to say anything to know what was happening inside him. the disbelief, the relief, the overwhelming feeling of being noticed after so long. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked over to his table once more. "You okay?" she asked, gently, her voice low. The man looked up at her, his eyes glistening. "I don't know how to explain it," he said, his voice trembling. "For so long, I felt invisible, like no one even saw me anymore. I can't remember the last time I felt this way," he admitted. "Like I mattered." At the counter, the other patrons had grown quiet, but their faces reflected the same emotion that hung in the air, a shared sense of connection and hope. One by one, a few of them began to approach the older man. "Thank you for letting us help," one woman said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've reminded all of us that we can make a difference." A man in a worn jacket stepped forward next, his voice gruff but kind. "I've been where you are," he said, nodding toward the envelope, "and I know how hard it is to accept help. But I'm telling you, it's okay. You've earned this." The older man looked up at each of them, his eyes full of gratitude, but still tinged with disbelief. "I don't even know what to say," he said, his voice cracking. "More than I ever expected, more than I deserve." "You deserve every bit of it," Maggie said firmly, her voice steady. "And when you're ready, you can pay it forward in your own way." The man nodded slowly, a smile breaking through the tears. "I will," he promised. "I don't know how yet, but I will." The room seemed lighter somehow, as if the kindness shared that evening had lifted a weight off everyone's shoulders. People who had come in as strangers now exchanged knowing smiles, their shared experience connecting them in an unexpected way. As the older man stood to leave, he turned to Maggie one last time. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice filled with sincerity. "For everything." Maggie nodded, her own eyes glistening. "Take care of yourself," she said, her smile warm. And as the man walked out of the diner, the envelope still in his hand, the other patrons slowly returned to their meals. But the atmosphere wasn't the same. It was softer, warmer, filled with the quiet understanding that they had all been part of something bigger that night. For Maggie, it was a moment she would carry with her for a long time. And for the older man, it was a turning point. A reminder that even when life feels heavy and lonely, there are still people willing to lift you up. This story reminds us of something we often forget in the rush of daily life: the power of noticing others. In a world where so many feel unseen and unheard, small gestures can create profound changes. Barron Trump's quiet act of kindness didn't just help one person. It sparked a ripple effect that brought an entire room of strangers together. Sometimes we underestimate the value of simple actions. Buying a meal, offering a kind word, or even just making someone feel noticed can mean the world to someone who feels invisible. These moments remind us that no matter how small our actions may seem, they carry the potential to touch lives in ways we may never fully understand. For the older man, it wasn't just about the money or the meal. It was about hope. Hope that people still care, that he isn't forgotten. And for everyone else in the diner, it was a moment of connection, a reminder that kindness is contagious. When one person steps up, it inspires others to do the same. This story also teaches us that kindness doesn't always need to be grand or showy. It's about being present, paying attention, and choosing to act when the opportunity arises. Each of us has the power to make a difference in someone's life, whether through a small gesture or a simple acknowledgement that they matter. So the next time you see someone struggling or feeling alone, remember this moment. Your kindness could be the spark that changes everything, not just for them, but for everyone around you. Because in the end, it's not about how much we give, but the impact of showing someone they're not alone. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need a reminder about the power of kindness. Let's spread the message that even small acts can create big changes. Don't forget to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories that inspire and uplift. Together, we can make the world a little brighter, one act of kindness at a time.